Hi, this is Lisa Somerville for Divinity Designs. Welcome to another Tuesday's tutorials. In this tutorial, I'm going to be sharing with you the quilted tile background die. The quilted tile background die measures 5 1/4 by 4 and is designed to fit on A2 cards. It can be used with both the A2 portrait and landscape card base with layer die sets, and also the matting rectangle die. When die cutting the quilted tile background die, all the pieces will fall from the die cut frame. You can then adhere the die cut panel to the layering panel from the A2 portrait or A2 landscape card base with layer die sets. And then you can attach that to the card base. To add a pop of color between the quilted tile background and the A2 portrait or landscape card base with layer die sets, you can also use our matting rectangle. That's the yellow panel that you see here on this card. Shown on this sample is the quilted tile background, the matting rectangle, and the A2 portrait card base. Shown on this sample is the quilted tile background, the matting rectangle, and the A2 portrait card base. When using the quilted tile background die, you'll also want to emboss this die set following the directions for your die cutting machine. The embossing will help define the stitching on the frame panel, and it will also bring out the details if you intend to inlay the die cut pieces back into the frame. On this piece, you can see that I've inlaid the die cut pieces that fall from within the frame on the quilted tile background die. Again, embossing your die will bring out the details of the die. Here you can see it layered on the matting rectangle and then the card base. Now in this sample, I simply die cut a piece of cardstock using the matting rectangle die. And then I used my frame as a guide and added all of the die cut and embossed pieces on top of the card, adding them on top of dimensionals. Here you can see that panel on top of the matting rectangle and then the A2 portrait card base. On this sample, using the quilted tile background, I used the die cut frame as a stencil and applied ink using our ink blending brushes over the frame die cut panel. Here you can see it added to the matting rectangle and the A2 portrait card base. And on this purple panel, instead of die cutting, I followed the embossing directions for my die cutting machine and embossed the die. When you emboss your background dies, they look like embossing folders. And here you can see this panel layered on top of the A2 portrait card base. Another way to get different looks using our background die is by adding some of our frame dies on top of the background dies. Here we have the quilted tile background along with the A2 thin pierced frame. When you add the A2 thin pierced frame to the background dies, it becomes the same size as the A2 portrait card base. You can also use our background dies along with the pierced frames die set. On this card, I used the largest die from our pierced frames die set and then adhered that over the quilted tile background. Now let me show you just how easy it is to achieve some of these looks using our quilted tile background die set along with additional Divinity Designs products. First, we're going to start out with the stenciling technique using our background dies. Again, in this video, I'm going to be using the quilted tile background. Here you can see I've already die cut this die from cardstock. To remove the cardstock from the die, I'm going to be using Divinity Designs Tool-in-One. You can use the brush end to roll over the die. That'll remove the die cut pieces from the die. Then you can use the piercing tip to remove the frame panel from the die. This is the piece that we're going to use as our stencil. I have a piece of cardstock that's slightly larger than my die cut panel. I'm going to place the cardstock on top of a piece of scrap paper Then I'm going to center the die cut panel over the cardstock panel. Then I'm going to use some removable tape to hold that die cut panel onto my cardstock panel. Next, I'll be using Divinity Designs blending brushes and ink to apply ink over the die cut panel. Again, I'm using my die cut panel as a stencil to create a background. I'll continue adding ink with the blending brushes until the background is completely covered. Once the background has been completely covered with ink using the blending brushes, I can remove my die cut background, leaving me the pattern that you see here. To die cut this decorative panel down to size, I can use the layering panel from the A2 Portrait or A2 Landscape card base with layer die set. And there you have the quilted tile background die cut panel used as a stencil on cardstock. Here you can see it layered on the matting rectangle and the A2 Portrait card base. If desired, you could also use that inked up die cut panel as an embellishment on your cards. Now let's take a look at a few more ways to use this background die. Here we have the quilted tile background, the matting rectangle, and the A2 Portrait card base. We're going to change up that background die by adding the A2 thin pierced frame. You'll die cut and emboss both these dies following the directions for your die cutting machine. Embossing the dies will bring out the details of the dies and also help define the piercing and the stitching on these die sets. I'm going to turn over the A2 thin pierced frame and work on the back side. I'll be adding barely art glue to the back side of the frame panel. Our background dies are 5 1/4 by 4. By adding the A2 thin pierced frame, this is going to become 5 1/2 by 4 1/4. Next, I'm going to adhere the quilted tile background die cut panel to the A2 thin pierced frame. You'll simply center that over the die cut frame and then hold it in place until your glue dries. The frame panel also adds for a thicker border so that you can easily turn the quilted tile background into a shaker card. Again, by adding that frame panel to the quilted tile background die cut, my panel now becomes 5 1/2 by 4 1/4, the same size as an A2 card. Now instead of die cutting our background die, I'm going to emboss it following the directions from my die cutting machine. Embossing the die instead of die cutting will leave your cardstock embossed so that it looks like you used an embossing folder. To emboss the die into the cardstock, instead of die cutting, I'm simply going to follow the embossing directions for my die cutting machine. I'm going to place the die on my platform with the cut side facing up. I'm then going to add my cardstock, my embossing mat, the clear mat for embossing, then my acrylic plate, and then I'm going to run it through my die cutting machine. I'll then use the tool in one to remove the cardstock panel from the die, and here you can see the cardstock is embossed instead of die cut. Next, we're going to do an inlay technique using the quilted tile background. I'm going to be using 2 pieces of cardstock. First, I'm going to die cut and emboss the quilted tile background from the blue cardstock. I'll use the tool in one to remove the die cut cardstock from the die. I'll use the brush side of the tool in one to remove those cardstock pieces from the die so that I can use the die to die cut my next piece of cardstock. For the white cardstock, I want to use the pieces that fall from the die as my inlaid pieces. So I'm going to place the die on top of the white cardstock, and I'm going to place a piece of removable tape on top of the die. My removable tape is cut slightly smaller than the die. Now I'm going to place that removable tape on the back side of the die. When I die cut and emboss, that's going to ensure that all those die cut pieces remain within the die. I'm going to die cut and emboss this following the directions for my die cutting machine. Next, I'm simply going to remove the frame panel from the die. Again, the removable tape that I used on the die ensures that all the die cut and embossed pieces remain within the die. I can then place the die cut and embossed frame panel back into the die. Next, I'm going to place a piece of cardstock that it has adhesive on one side over this die cut panel. That way, all the inlaid pieces have a piece of cardstock to adhere to. I can then flip that over and press down on all the die cut and embossed pieces that I want inlaid back into the die cut frame. Once I've pressed down firmly, I can remove the removable tape from the die. You can then remove the die from the cardstock, and you can see that those pieces are easily inlaid in the frame without having to glue them all individually into place. For this next technique using our background die, we're simply going to use all those die cut and embossed pieces that fall from the frame. I'm going to be using the die cut frame as a guide to adhere those pieces into place. This technique, we're going to use 2 pieces of cardstock. The white cardstock was die cut and embossed using the layering panel from the A2 portrait card base with layer die set. And then I have a piece of rose cardstock. From the rose cardstock, I'm going to die cut and emboss the quilted tile background die, following the directions for my die cutting machine. Now remember, for this technique, we only want the pieces that normally fall from the die cut panel, as we're going to use those as an embellishment on the card. So I'm simply going to use the tool-in-one, and I'm only going to remove the frame die cut from the die. Normally, I don't have any issues with the die cut pieces falling from the center of the die. But if you have issues with the pieces falling from the die, before die cutting and embossing, place a piece of removable tape on the back side to hold those die cut pieces in place. So here I have the die cut and embossed frame panel that I can use on another card. Next, I'm going to place dimensionals on the back side of all of the die cut pieces that still remain within the die. Continue adding dimensionals or foam tape to all those die cut pieces until the background is completely covered. To ensure proper spacing of these die cut pieces as embellishments on my cardstock panel, I adhere the frame back in place over the back of the die. Next, I'm going to remove the release paper from all of my foam tape. I'll be doing this off camera. Now that the release paper has been removed from all of the foam tape, I can add this to my cardstock base panel. You don't have to use foam tape for this technique. I used foam tape because I wanted raised dimension behind the die cut pieces. But you can also use glue dots or glue for this technique. Again, the frame panel was added just so that I could use it as an alignment tool to make sure that all my pieces are aligned properly. Now I can flip the die over and press down on the die cut pieces to adhere those to the cardstock. Then you can remove the die and the frame from the cardstock panel, leaving you with the die cut pieces as embellishments on your card. So as you can see, there are many different ways that you can use our background dies. I hope this tutorial has inspired you to use your background dies in different ways. For more inspiration using these and additional Divinity Designs products, visit the product pages on our website, like us on Facebook, or follow us on Pinterest and Instagram.